All right, we'll go ahead and get started here. Thanks again and welcome everybody to today's webinar, Cyber Resilience in Action, Incident Response Plans for Modern Organizations. Our goal today is to teach you a little bit about incident response plans, what they are, why your organization needs one, as well as some best practices. And at the end, we'll have some time for questions. So if you do have a question, please write it down. And at the end, we'll open up. I'm sure if you do have a question, others will find it helpful. So we want to make sure that we get to those. And we will also be having a drawing at the end for all of you that do attend for a Yeti water bottle. Before we jump into the topic, I'll go ahead and introduce our speakers for today, starting with my co-host, Melissa Krasnow.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining. I'm Melissa Krasnow. I'm a partner at VLP Law Group, where I advise companies on privacy, data security, technology matters, as well as cyber governance. And this would include data breaches. This includes written information security programs, incident response plans, particularly that are written, the topic of today's webinar, tabletop exercises, cyber liability insurance policies, and I also advise boards of directors and officers on privacy, data security, and technology risk oversight and developments. And I'll turn it over to Nick, my co-host.
Hello, everyone. Nick Stevens, CEO and co-founder of Heroic Technologies, a cybersecurity evangelist and co-author of an Amazon best-selling book, Managing Your Business Risk in the Cybersecurity Minefield. I'm a cybersecurity, IT, and compliance professional with 20 years of experience across various industries, including legal, accounting, manufacturing, and nonprofits. I lead a dedicated team that provides comprehensive cybersecurity, compliance, and IT services, really tailored to organizations with annual revenue between 3 and 50 million. And we have 2 offices in San Jose, California, and Beaverton, Oregon. So I wanted to start off the conversation today with really defining what an incident actually is. We're not going to pull out a incident response plan every time somebody gets a spam message. So an incident is really an unexpected event that disrupts normal operations or poses a risk to an organization. This can include what would be defined as a security breach, natural disaster, health emergency like a pandemic. These include incidents that threaten an organization's security integrity or availability of information resources. For the bulk of our talk today, our focus will be on cyber incidents or events which may or may not eventually be determined to be something like security breaches or cyber attacks such as malware infections, denial of service attacks, insider threats, unauthorized access, or data breaches. And Melissa will give us a legal definition of an incident.
So to use the familiar lawyer response, Nick, it depends. So it would depend on the law, depend on an enforcement action, depend on guidance. But I think if I want to make one point, it's that how you describe things can have some importance. So typically, if something is wrong, when I will get a call, and I do handle incidents and breaches, a client might say, we've had a data breach. To me, that's a legal conclusion. There are laws, both through legislation and contract, which I'll talk about later in this presentation, that might define something as a data breach. But simply put, you don't know until you get a sense of the facts, put them together, and apply them to the law or other requirements. So to sort of make the conclusion that something's a breach, that could have import. So what I want to convey is it's an incident until it's a breach. Further, under different laws and guidance and contracts, it may say incident, it may say breach, it may say security incident. For healthcare, which is HIPAA, it's a federal law, it may say unauthorized use and disclosure under the California Consumer Privacy Act, California Privacy Rights Act. it's another definition and it doesn't have the word breach in it. So be mindful. Second, something in multiple categories. So for example, how is it defined? In contract, it could be defined in multiple ways. What's the definition? What's required if you have this event? Is it unauthorized? Is it authorized? Is it misuse, loss, theft, alteration, destruction, or other compromise? And you should look at all definitions together to make sure you're covering everything. I mentioned the California Consumer Privacy Act, California Privacy Rights Act. Here's their definition, and it's a mouthful. Unauthorized access and exfiltration, theft, or disclosure of non-encrypted and non-redacted personal information. It doesn't have the words incident or breach. Why is this important? Sometimes when you negotiate a contract, if you want to be alerted to such an event, sometimes I will ask a client that wants on behalf of a client that wants to be alerted to this event to put this precise language in the agreement. So their contract partner can't say, well, this wasn't in the agreement, we don't have to notify. Maybe it would be an incident anyway, but I add this language because it's a specific requirement, presuming this law, the California Consumer Privacy Act, California Privacy Rights Act, which as it's been amended, if it's encompassed by this. Another point I want to make, and this happens in contract, so law can define a breach or event, so can a contract. Like the law is the law, but a contract is what's negotiated between two parties. It's what they negotiate, agree to, and sign, right? Sometimes you can have exceptions to an incident. In other words, something qualifies as an incident, except that it doesn't, hence the exception. So be on alert for that, particularly in business partner contracts.
Excellent.
I'll
Thank
turn
you.
it back to Nick.
Now we'll move on to what is an incident response plan. The truth is, you don't have to really be doing anything wrong to get in trouble with hackers. Supply chain problems, natural disasters. The best companies in the world accept that trouble will come and they prepare to meet it head on. The purpose of an incident response plan is to have written, and I want to underline that, written guidelines for effectively responding to and managing security incidents within your organization. The plan ensures that incidents are properly identified, assessed, contained, eradicated, and recovery time is reduced, and our overall response to threats and other business impacting events is continuously improved. Famous boxer Mike Tyson has a quote that every boxer has a plan until they get punched in the face. Imagine that. A boxer trains every day for a fight, and then the first punch that they take, they forget their game plan. When it comes to businesses, especially small to mid-sized businesses, unfortunately, they often don't have an incident response plan. And when it comes to using it, often it's too late to create a plan. So this is why it's so important to not only have an incident response plan, but to have it written down. So now let's look a little further into why you have a incident response plan. Melissa, can you take us through some of these?
Sure, thanks, Nick. So Nick emphasized the words written. Why is this important? Well, if it's not written, if it's asked about, this could be by a regulator, this could be in the context of litigation, this could also be in the context of a business partner. What's the point? Also, what does it say? It's documented, this is the response plan versus I think it said this or that, so hence written. I think number one, required by law. I think increasingly, and I'm going to give some examples, increasingly it's being required. So stepping back, often in the world of data security, you have practices, and some will call them best practices. I'll give you a different example. I don't know how many of you in the audience, unfortunately, might have seen a breach notification letter. Dear, your name, Unfortunately, our company had a breach or an incident. We think your information was involved. Here, we're going to give you some credit monitoring in 1 year, 2 years. You've got to do this to invoke your credit monitoring. For years, that had been considered a best practice. It was not required by law. Interestingly, it increasingly has become required by law. Not every law, a handful of breach notification laws require the offering of credit monitoring. It's termed identity theft prevention and mitigation. But even for specific time periods, it's now mandated by a couple of the state breach notification laws. So this is an example of a best practice which has become part of laws. I think increasingly what we're seeing in the legal land is written incident response plans are being required by law. So let me give you a couple recent examples. The Federal Trade Commission is the federal regulator of privacy, and they've been enforcing. And one of the areas they enforce is with financial institutions. And you're probably saying, I know what that is. Well, if you're the Federal Trade Commission, it's an expanded definition under its FTC safeguards rule. Basically, anyone that is deemed a financial institution, so a mortgage lender, payday lender, finance company, mortgage broker, check casher, wire transfer, credit counselor, financial advisor, tax preparation firm, etc., and finders, which bring together buyers and sellers and then let parties negotiate and consummate a transaction. Another example that you probably hadn't thought of, or maybe you had, a university. And most of them do lend money, so they're subject to this as well. So this rule was very general, and then it was very recent. More recently, it was amended, and so it had always required a written information security program. Now it requires, and it's in effect now, a written information security program that includes a written incident response plan. And it's not just a written incident response plan. It spells out the components and contents of the plan. We're actually, when we go through this presentation, have a number of these required. I won't go through them, but we will address these types of content in our presentation. Another one, and I think, again, you might say, well, these are only financial institutions. New York Department of Financial Institutions. So if you do business with an insurance company, they are likely subject to this. If they do business in New York. And it's probably the most state of the art. It's called the New York Department of Financial Services Cybersecurity Regulation. Okay, so they also require written incident response plans. What is fascinating is, and they also spell out the content, it's a little different from the Federal Trade Commission, but here's what's also fascinating about this. You are required, if you're regulated, to ensure that current copies of the plans are distributed or otherwise accessible, including during a cybersecurity event, to all employees necessary to implement such plans. So hence, why should it be written? Further, if you're covered by this, you've got to provide relevant training to all employees responsible for implementing the plans regarding their roles and responsibilities. And then finally, there's sort of a frequency. At a minimum, you must annually test the incident response plan with all staff and management critical to the response and revise as necessary. Even though this cybersecurity rule applies to financial institutions, I think it's sort of a best of its class requirement. And I think companies, even if you're not subject to this, it would benefit from just looking at the requirements. I think these are very good practices. Another really interesting thing, I mentioned this, the Federal Trade Commission is the federal regulator. So when they enforce against a company, there is usually a settlement that's negotiated. Usually companies, although not always, but usually companies will agree to a settlement with them. So most recently, February 23rd of this year, they finalized an order with a provider of services to prisons called Global Tellink. It failed to secure lots of sensitive data for lots of users and failed to give alerts to those who were affected by the incident. So as part of its settlement, this isn't the only thing, but it's part, they must at a minimum implement and maintain a written incident response plan designed to ensure identification, investigation, and response to unauthorized access of personal information. Must include policies and procedures, timely investigation of data security events, and remediation. And they must revise and update and respond to any changes in their networks. And you're thinking, okay, that's the Federal Trade Commission. Well, you probably live in a state, the state has an attorney general. So I'll use an example from California. California Attorney General is a very high profile enforcer of both privacy and data security. I hope none of you were affected, but the likelihood is at least someone probably was. Anthem, which is a health insurance provider, had a huge breach, and it was a breach in 2014, way back when. Attackers used phishing emails to gain access to its network and accessed its most sensitive database, which included personal information. So the California Attorney General, in its settlement, its judgment, it said Anthem has to develop, implement, and maintain a written incident response plan. And then had requirements, and it required also to update with material changes. And so again, so these enforcement actions, they are also the law. In other words, it's a wake-up call to companies, and you don't always think of them. You look at the law, maybe you look at your contracts. I think this is another category. So the enforcement, they're both enforcing and settling with companies where there was an issue, but further, I think they're taking the tack that it's education to other companies. Don't be in this position. Don't let this happen. I mentioned guidance. So another area is a regulator may say something, and it will specifically say it's guidance. It's not a requirement, but it's something I think companies should consider. So you might have heard very recently, this year in February, the CISA, which is the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, which is the US's cyber defense agency, they came out with an update of its cybersecurity framework 2.0. It's like after 10 years, that was 1.0 in 2014. Now we have 2.0. And they talk about an incident response plan. And what do they say? It's a written document. It's formally approved by senior leadership and helps your organization before, during, and after a confirmed or suspected security incident. And it talks about a lot of the content we will talk about in a subsequent slide. Really interestingly, and this is guidance, not annually, not after material changes, they say, their guidance, CISA says, review this plan quarterly. The best incident response plans are living documents that evolve with business changes. This was really interesting to me because it means a company would really have to make a concerted effort to do this quarterly. I think annually makes sense. Quarterly seem pretty frequent, but I wonder if there are companies out there that are doing this. And in tandem, conduct an attack simulation exercise, sometimes called a tabletop exercise, in connection with the incident response plan. And then finally, something that doesn't unfortunately always happen, and this is usually in incident response plans, hold a retrospective meeting afterwards, sometimes called a post-mortem. This does not, frankly, always happen. It's good because you learn about gaps, you realize what you've learned, and then this could contribute, for example, to updating the incident response plan. So let's see. Yes, and I mentioned the cybersecurity framework. It talks about incident response plans, and it's executed in coordination with relevant third parties once an incident is declared. And this framework is supposed to apply whether you're government, industry, academia, nonprofit. It's supposed to be flexible enough to apply to everyone. And so they're talking about incident response plans as well. I mentioned required by contracts. It is whatever is negotiated between parties, but I do see this in contracts. So the issue is usually the minimum is requiring an incident response plan, depending on what side you are, but hopefully it says written. I have also seen agreements say not only written information and written incident response plan, I keep mangling that, but spelling out content, like you're telling your contract partner what's supposed to be in their plan. I think the key takeaway here is if your organization is negotiating agreements, do you actually comply with this? Are you just saying, yep, we do this, no problem? Or, I mean, is this acceptable to have your business partner basically weighing in on what content or whether you have an incident response plan? But a good reason to have an incident response plan. Finally, cyber insurance, and I know we've got folks on here from the insurance industry. There is an application in connection with getting cyber liability insurance. It's not uncommon to ask, do you have a written incident response plan? It's not uncommon also to ask, how often is this plan tested? And I've seen quarterly, I've seen semi-annually, I've seen annually. And then interestingly, sort of along the lines of the New York Department of Financial Services, are copies of the incident response plan stored so that they'll be accessible if the applicant's network became completely unavailable. So these are different areas where it's a best practice. It's being required by some laws that the examples I gave are particular to the financial services industry, but there's enforcement by the FTC, there's enforcement by the California Attorney General, requiring them after a breach or other incidents. So I think more reasons to have them. And I guess in a nutshell, they're a best practice, but I think increasingly they're going to become part of other laws. Nick, I think you might have some feelings about that.
Agreed. I definitely think that there will be more legislation coming down the road. I don't know when, but probably in the next 3 to 5 years, there will likely be legislation. Just like the FTC safeguards, there will be, as the breaches seem to be increasing, ever increasing. I think there will be increased legislation probably in the next 3 to 5 years, requiring more and more organizations, especially those that handle sensitive data for consumers, that have to have increased data protections and incident response plans in place. And that kind of takes me to the point of the last point of why to have a incident response plan, which is going to be risk mitigation. Few points on risk mitigation, and the first one really being preparedness and rapid response. A incident response plan, or IRP, really ensures that your organization is going to be prepared to kind of respond quickly and effectively if there is an incident. Since you're going to already have that predefined procedures and roles and responsibilities in place. And ideally, if you're doing what Melissa has talked about and you're doing those annual testing of the plan, or even quarterly, as apparently the new version 2.0 of NIST is talking about, then you've already walked through it and perhaps you have some muscle memory, which means that you'll be able to quickly respond and reduce the time that the any potential downtime, and limit any potential damage. And that's really what it kind of comes down to, is minimizing downtime and really minimizing the financial loss and any reputational damage that may happen to the organization. And that's where an incident response plan is really most effective. It's going to maintain the business operations by mitigating the impact to the organization, because you're able to activate any backup systems. From a IT perspective, you can reroute network traffic, initiate business continuity plans, and really get things back online as quickly as possible. Additionally, you can kind of look from a cost reduction perspective. While there is a time commitment, and perhaps you're looking at bringing in outside assistance if you don't have the internal expertise to implement a incident response plan. There's definitely there's time investment for the planning and the training to implement an incident response plan. But there's actually quite a bit of evidence that implementing a plan will, in the long run, especially if you have an incident, there will be savings. IBM did a study last year in 2003 that found that organizations that implemented a incident response plan saved over 2.6 million if they suffered a breach or cyber incident versus those that had no plan in place. So now we'll go ahead and take a look at the elements within a incident response plan. And Melissa will go ahead and kick us off, starting with the goals of a plan.
Sure. Thanks, Nick. Before that, I mangled or transposed. So the quarterly comes from CISA, not the NIST
Excuse me.
cybersecurity. No, that was my mistake. So that comes from CISA. If anyone wants to see where I'm getting this information, please email me after the end, but I mangled that, so I apologize. Okay, slide 6. So we talked about required content. It depends, right? If it's the law, the settlement, the guidance, but Nick and I put together the slide. Really, Nick took the laboring oar. These are some commonly found components or contents, because a lot of times, okay, an organization is like, great, let's do an incident response plan. The question then becomes, what is in there? What's the content of this incident response plan? Very fundamentally, it has to have a goal. And so there are templates, but it should also be particular to the business. And I think just as much as having a goal, it's also the scope. Like, is this for everything? Or, for example, are these particular types of incidents, I'm just making this up, would this accept or carve out ransomware, which has its own nuances, which I won't go into here. And then to that point, what types of incidents are covered by this incident response plan? You could have a company that could be, let's use the case of an organization could be regulated in terms of healthcare. It could be regulated by the FTC safeguards rule. I'm thinking of one example right now. I'm also thinking of a healthcare entity which could be regulated in the form of an insurance company. So, and then the classic widget maker. They're regulated as well, just probably fewer laws, but again, so how is and it could be along the lines of the law. It also could depend, and I think to a great extent, on, what do the contracts that this organization has negotiated? Have they talked about incidents? Have the contracts defined the incidents? Further, if they have cyber insurance, or they're thinking about what would be required to be in something reportable under that. So another important distinction, I think, does this just pertain to personal information? Is it confidential information, which could encompass personal information? It could also include company sensitive information that's more business information. There could be other information. So you will have to tailor it, is what I'm saying. Despite the fact that there are templates, it will have to be particular to the company. Each company will have its internal processes, and you'll need to detail these for how to respond to the incident. Clear roles and responsibilities. So someone will have to lead this. There will have to be a core team. There can also be a broader team. It's really important to make sure. So, for example, Nick, would at your company, would it use your name or would it use your title? In other words, the idea, I'm not saying you're leaving your company, but in other words, to make sure that the person with your title is responsible. I'm making this up, but in other words, if you say Nick and he leaves and that's what the plan says, and there's a new person whose name is not Nick. So you have to think about things like this. I'm not saying anything. You're with your company, and you're the founder, but this is like one of those things in drafting a response plan. Is it the CEO? Is it the head of IT? And then, do you want more than one person responsible? There are pros and cons. It depends on the organization. What are their duties? And, who will maintain this incident response plan? Um, and then I look at it also, there's both an internal team, there's also an external team. You're going to work with experts, hopefully a little self-interested. You're going to have your law firm and your legal counsel. The other point I'll make is a cyber liability insurance point. Um, Policies will have what's known as panel counsel. They're pre-vetted and approved by the insurance company. Organizations don't always realize this. So the panel counsel may match their outside legal counsel, it may not. So when you have an incident, what happens if your legal counsel isn't the same as the counsel that's been approved by the cyber? You can get an exception approved. It takes time, and you're in a time-sensitive situation. You can have people added, but you should probably do that beforehand. If you were working on your incident response plan, this is an issue that might have come up. Another great example is relationships and communication channels with outside law enforcement, such as the FBI, the Secret Service. There could also be others as well, including CISA, which I mentioned, particularly if you're in the realm of critical infrastructure. Can you reach your local FBI cyber office? Do you have a cell phone number for one of the cyber contacts? Because incidents don't always happen between 9 and 5. They often happen at weird times. So this is just, and this also gets to communications, both internal and external. There should be a plan in place for guiding them. There's a lot to talk about. And I'm gonna turn this over. I'm gonna turn this over though now to Nick.
Thank you. All right, now moving on to remediation. Remediation, first, when there is an incident, obviously you will have to, I mean, you want to stop the incident, and this will obviously depend on your organization and what your capabilities are. If you have an in-house team, or if perhaps you're outsourcing your team, you have the capabilities to stop the incident from spreading, but then you also have to be cognizant of working with as Melissa said, your attorney and your insurance carrier, because you have to, your insurance carrier, especially for your cyber liability policy, they may have stipulations on what notification to them and what can be done, as far as they may have their own, for their policy, they may have a team for forensics that they may want to bring in. So once you've stopped the incident from going further and continuing to damage the network, you may have to pause and no longer necessarily complete remediation within the network, but allow the insurance carrier to take on their role from that point on. So you'll have to know what your insurance policy says as far as that goes. But excluding that portion, you do want to assess and identify the weaknesses. As far as the plan goes, you want to assess and identify the weaknesses, so you can kind of prioritize the remediation, because you want to be able to effectively be able to ensure that any weaknesses in the network or the organization, it's not going to occur again. You also want to be able to implement any corrective actions. So corrective actions are likely going to take the form of, from a technical perspective, of patching a vulnerability, implementing some sort of security control. An example of this might be changes to a firewall, antivirus, multi-factor authentication, or enhancing security awareness training, or a mixture of all three of these things. And then you'll conduct some sort of a post-incident review or kind of a root cause analysis, trying to understand if there's any sort of underlying pattern or systemic issue that may allow this type of issue to occur again, so that you can go ahead and make a policy change or process improvement to try to stop that from happening. Now, moving on to documentation, you want to make sure that you have some standard reporting procedures in place. Defining templates and workflows to ensure that there's some consistency and documenting your incidents. And it doesn't have to be overly complicated. If we work with an organization, starting off with, it can just be basic Word documents. If we're assisting with any sort of a incident, it could be as simple as a OneNote, having a centralized repository to put all of this information in. Microsoft OneNote makes a simple centralized location where everything can be backed up. A team can put all of the information into it, and it can be easily shared externally as needed. And that's one of the key things. You want to be able to facilitate that sharing of knowledge and be able to reference it down the road, because archiving that information is absolutely critical, because you want to be able to reference it in the future. Now, moving to the evaluation, Melissa has mentioned this before, and this really comes into kind of the testing of the plans. And regular testing can come in two different ways. Testing can be done annually, or as we mentioned before, quarterly, if you so choose. And when you conduct the tests, you're really going to be looking at the lessons learned. First, you can test after a actual incident, which hopefully you won't have to do terribly often. And then at which point you're going to be identifying areas of improvement, looking for response procedures, controls over our overall security posture, and findings from the lessons learned, areas where you can improve documentation, corrective actions, or enhancements to strengthen your overall incident response capabilities. Or you can do kind of a tabletop type exercise. So this is going to be more of a pre-planned scenario where you bring together the incident response team, and you actually walk through the scenario in a more controlled environment, where you actually walk through the plan, you test your communications, and you kind of have a pre-planned goal on what you want to test. And I'll talk about that a little bit further on one of our next slides. And here we'll move a little further into some of our best practices. Melissa?
Thanks, Nick. Can I add to something you said? It sort of triggered something in my mind before
Absolutely.
I go into 24/7 contact information. You were talking about having things accessible for the future, and I've been emphasizing that contracts are a source of law. Like if you negotiate something about an incident, even something about data security, it potentially could come into play during your response. So one really interesting thing, it sounds so obvious and basic, but except that it's difficult to actually implement in reality. When there's an incident, something I usually ask is, are there contracts which could be implicated? It's pretty obvious if it's a service provider to the company that had the incident, right? It would be the contractor, multiple contracts with that service provider. But so it's not just easily accessing the contracts and getting copies over. This will sound interesting. Are those contracts fully signed? I can't tell you the number of times the company's under the impression they are under contract and everyone is performing. They don't have a signed copy, or there's one signature but not the other, or it's completely unsigned. So it's sort of part of your vendor and contract management, but this is a really important point, and you'll need your contracts pronto in any of these situations. So to Nick's point of having things accessible, for the future. That's a key one. So on to best practices, 24/7 contact information. I talked about having sort of these core teams, both internal and external. So interestingly, what if your contact information, I'm making this up for your company, is it's ABC company, so it's someone's name at abc.com. What if that's the only means of contacting? What if you don't have their cell phone numbers? What if your system goes down? This has happened and you don't have another way to contact someone. So you should always have multiple ways of communicating. Another classic example, I was named on a company's response plan. They had only my work telephone number. They did not have my cell phone number. They did not have my home number, which, given what I do, is fair game. How did we find out? We found out in the context of a tabletop exercise. The incident had occurred. Well, it's Saturday. I'm going to call Melissa. Except, am I necessarily checking my email? I usually do, but am I always on email? Not necessarily. But they didn't have any, they only had an office phone, which I found amazing. So to the point, these don't happen 9 to 5. Further, I think it's kind of a trend. If you look at major holidays, usually you will see something happening in the news. And so it's sort of maybe not the most optimistic thing, but when I'm talking with clients before, for example, a holiday weekend, such as the 4th of July or Labor Day, I say, be prepared. Hopefully nothing bad happens, but be prepared if something does, because I'm seeing things happen over holidays. And we're in spring. St. Patrick's Day is this Sunday. Easter and other holidays are going to be occurring over the spring. I wouldn't be surprised if, unfortunately, bad things happen. Such is the nature, but have the 24/7 contact information. Build a relationship with your local law enforcement. So another point, not just so, suppose it is one person, this FBI agent, or the Secret Service agent, you've got their email, you've got their office number, you've even got their cell phone number. Good. There is turnover in their ranks. Even the head of office can turn over. And you don't always know when this happens. So it's always good to keep in touch with them, whoever is responsible at your organization. I try to keep in touch with them frequently, and I do for a variety of reasons, but I'm always surprised. Oh, had no idea. It's now agent, new name, right? New contact information. So if you emailed the person, hopefully they would respond and tell you you need to contact this other person, but not always. So you need to keep that current. Not unlike a company, there is mobility. So you have to keep this current, even with your own employees. There is turnover. And then have documentation, an easy way to document everything, as Nick went over. But have your list of contacts. But this really needs to be made up to date. And maybe you're reacting because you've heard someone has left and there's a new FBI agent. But sort of hand in glove, you have to update the contact list with the new information. It's also very good to forge a relationship before you really need to reach out to someone. So if you're calling them or emailing them over the weekend, they know who you are, you forge that relationship. So and then the question is sort of notification, like what's the order? Usually companies' first calls are to legal to coordinate. There are a variety of reasons for this. Attorney-client privilege, is it a legal breach or not? But I will be working with the insurance brokers. I'll be working with the carriers. So there are notification obligations. So a couple things. You don't think of notifying the insurance broker as maybe a notification, but it is. They may not know this has occurred, right? And under your policy, you may be charged with letting them know. And the question is, well, does it qualify? But you'd want to reach out at a minimum to your broker to get the process rolling. In addition, law enforcement, they may need to step in, they may need to do certain things. This may stay some timing in terms of when you give external notification, like, for example, to affected individuals or even regulators. But that in a way is another notification, even though you're reaching out to them for help. Under the variety of laws, there are notifications. In every law, it is to individuals. Usually and increasingly, there is a regulator, whether it's a federal regulator or a state attorney general or other regulator, and it will depend on the law. But these are all notifications. And then if you're publicly traded, there's SEC guidance and disclosure, which has been updated with quick turnaround. So a lot of different things are going on. But if you think of notification, there's a variety of notification. Are you going to be doing something generally on your website? There may be good and not as good reasons for doing this. And then how must the incident be reported? What's the timing? What is required to be reported? And just a lot of different moving parts. So immediate notification, it's attention. You want to make sure that you know what happened. You won't always know completely what happened because it's a poor example, but you've seen incidents where a company immediately says, we think it's this, it's impacted this million. And then very quickly thereafter, nope, it's an additional 1 million, and they keep amending. Sometimes there are reasons for them to be doing things almost in real time, but if you don't have to, it's usually good to be able to get as many facts together so you don't have to update as much. Particularly if a company, oh, it was only 1 million, and then it becomes 2 million, 3 million, et cetera. The company looks a lot worse, but it depends on the particular scenario. And then Nick mentioned root cause analysis, which takes time. Forensics, Nick mentioned sort of the mechanics. Maybe under a cyber liability policy, you're using the panel forensics firm. So in addition to panel legal counsel, for other providers, whether it's credit monitoring, forensics, public relations are some examples. They have their own panel. If you are seeking to deviate and use a different provider, the question is, can you get sort of approval? It will take time in this process. So by going through the incident response plan process and maybe testing, oh, okay, we need credit monitoring. We want to use X. Forensics, we want to use Y. Oh, they aren't covered under our policy. I'll talk with the insurer. Maybe they'll approve a different counsel in our case. That will take time. So immediate notification, there is a short time frame under many laws and guidance, but you want to make sure you get it right as well. A lot of times it's an interesting dynamic. Sometimes clients are like, we've got to do this, we've got to do this. The contract says 2 days. I'm making this up. And I said, wait a second. Wouldn't you rather sort of have more information, even if you're telling them on the 11th day? I know the facts, it depends on the situation. My inclination is make sure you get as much known and right as possible. If a contract partner is going to complain, there's bigger issues than like an additional day late, versus having incomplete information, having a lot of questions that aren't able to be answered. In any case, I'm going to throw it back to Nick.
Thank you. All right, going into some other best practices. Hopefully we've proven on this webinar a little bit that professional consultation is never a bad idea. One example I have, expertise in some current standards and regulations. Melissa's gone in quite a bit of depth on FTC safeguards. I have one example from real world experience, actually a current client of Heroic Technologies is a organization that gives loans out to minority entrepreneurs, and they were unaware that they are subject to FTC safeguards. And we were able to help them become compliant with that by helping them put together a incident response plan, as well as put in place some of the other cybersecurity requirements, including encryption, multi-factor authentication, and some of the other requirements for the FTC safeguards. But those are some of the other some of the items that professional consultation can help with. Some other areas where professional consultation can help are helping with the tailored assessment and mitigation strategies, and just bringing kind of an objective third-party perspective. Additionally, I think professional consultation will help with resource optimization and kind of bringing some cost efficiency. It doesn't necessarily make sense if you're a smaller organization to have your own in-house counsel, or if you don't have your own in-house IT department or cybersecurity resources. That's where outsourced consultation might be a little bit more efficient. As far as incident response testing and frequency, we've kind of discussed that to an extent, but I'll kind of cover it a bit more. Incident response plans and the kind of general preparedness of the team should be tested, as we've covered already, at a minimum annually. And using pre-planned tabletop exercises, we really want to align with the industry standards and test the practices against kind of the evolving threat landscape. And you want to retest whatever there's a significant change in the organization systems, whether that be the network or other regulatory requirements. Some exercises, all the exercises should adhere to the following requirements to really be successful. So they should simulate various security incidents to test the preparedness and effectiveness of the incident response procedure, and the coordination of the IRT, or the incident response team. The exercises should involve the key stakeholders and participants from the different departments. So that could be IT, legal, HR, senior management. They should focus on assessing the organization's ability to identify, contain, eradicate, and recover from the different types of security incidents, while making sure that they still adhere to the written incident response plan. Then the findings from the exercises should be documented, and you should have recommendations for improvement identified, so you can go ahead and implement those to enhance the IRP for the next round. So that's a key point. You want to make sure that as you're going through the exercise, that you're taking notes and making sure, okay, what are the weaknesses in this and how are we going to improve it for the next time? And then you're actually implementing those improvements, because you want it to be a living document that's constantly improving. And a kind of a quick note on that, as far as the effectiveness of incident response planning and testing, I was on a panel a couple weeks ago for CFOs regarding cybersecurity updates, and I was joined by the CISO, or the Chief Information Security Officer, of a good size law firm. There are about 900 attorneys and staff, and they were discussing their incident response plan testing. And they actually do quarterly testing, and they were running a test, I believe it was 2017, 2018, and their scenario at that time was for SARS, or severe acute respiratory syndrome. And they found a list of necessary improvements that they needed to make. So they went ahead and made those improvements. And several years later, what happened? COVID. So they found themselves very well prepared for the COVID pandemic. And though they were a large brick and mortar law firm, they were very well prepared to be able to handle the pandemic, because they were able to implement their IRP and respond very rapidly, and essentially move all of their people to a hybrid environment with very little interruption to their workflow. So it just shows what a well orchestrated and well tested incident response plan can do. So that kind of moves us into kind of the final portion. So we've really covered quite a lot today. And when you kind of look at an incident response process as a whole, we've really just kind of focused on step one, which is, preparation and what an organization needs to prepare itself for an incident. Especially we've really focused on kind of cyber attacks. And while a written incident response plan is technically the first step, it's kind of the most important step as it really dictates the success of the rest of the process. I think there's a quote that really sums up incident response plans and the importance of preparation from FBI hostage negotiator Chris Voss. It says, when the pressure is on, you don't rise to the occasion. You fall to the highest level of preparation. And if you haven't noticed, things are changing quite a bit, and they have been over the last several years, and cyber attacks are way up. There was a study last year that the estimated cost of cybercrime on the world economy was $10 trillion overall, making it the third largest economy after the US and China. The biggest difference is cybercrime is growing 15% year over year, something that I think the US and China would be very envious of. So now is the time to begin preparation for putting your organization on the right footing and being ready to respond. And remember, done is better than perfect. If you get the first draft completed and commit to annual testing, it'll improve over time. So that really concludes our content for today. So I know we kind of came up to the end, but I'm willing to stay after, and if Melissa is as well, we can go ahead and take some questions.